Hi everybody, welcome back to English 221. This is for our class for Monday, the 8th of February, where we are continuing to discuss the sonnets. And last class we talked a little bit about Sonnet 15, When I Consider Everything That Grows, and how that was in the early set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron. And I wanted to continue today with two other sonnets from that early set of sonnets, and then we could shift over to the three sonnets that I had selected to represent the later set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to a woman who's known as the Dark Lady. And that means, too, that we're getting near to our submission for our first journal, which is due on Wednesday, the 10th, by 11:59 p.m. or earlier. And I ask that you just send that to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu via PDF so that I can review it and then send that back to you. I am not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics, basically just content. So you can think of it as a kind of conversation on paper. And I will give it a check mark grade, with a plus being excellent, or a check plus being very good, or a check being satisfactory, which is where most of the grades end up being. Though there is also less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And the journal should be approximately a page long or so, but they can be as long or as short as you would like them to be. And for this first journal, you can proceed in several different ways. You can talk about all 6 of the sonnets that I had assigned, or if you prefer, you can just focus on a few of the sonnets out of the 6, or even just one in depth, however you would like to proceed. And last class I was talking about how important it is to hear the sonnets being read out loud so that you can appreciate the musicality. And I had included a link to Sir Patrick Stewart, who read the sonnets out loud, and he began in the early days of the coronavirus, reading a sonnet a day. And you can also listen to sonnets through an audiobook, and that link is included below in our class notes. And the nice thing about this audiobook is that it is available for free, just like Sir Patrick Stewart's sonnets as well. So you could listen to the sonnets if you so wanted to. And we began talking very briefly about Sonnet 18, which is probably the most famous poem ever written, and certainly Shakespeare's most famous sonnet. The "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And again, realizing that this is part of the early set of sonnets. So according to scholars, this would have been written to a young man. And this poem is oftentimes misread because it's read as a romantic poem that would be written to a woman in an attempt to woo her. And while the sonnet is general enough so that it could be used in that manner, and that's probably one of the reasons why this sonnet is so popular, is because it is so general that it can be used in a lot of different situations. Note that we're never given any pronouns in this sonnet that would indicate a specific gender. So the sonnet begins with I and thee being you. So I wanted to read this sonnet to you, Sonnet 18, that begins with the question, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee." So we can see that this sonnet gives us nature imagery, just like we saw with the previous sonnet, Sonnet 15. And the sonnet details all of the flaws associated with summer. Summer is usually considered to be the height of life and the height of the year, and it's oftentimes used in literature to represent perfection. And this sonnet talks about that as perfect as summer is, it still has its flaws. That this person is more lovely and more temperate, more dependable, more beautiful than summer. Why? Because rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. In other words, the darling buds being the new flowers that are still buds that haven't opened yet. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. In other words, there can be inclement weather. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. And I love the idea of the use of the word lease, not own, because the lease is temporary. Basically, the owner of summer is the creator, God. We just have, as humans, the opportunity to experience it for a brief amount of time. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. In other words, sometimes the sun is too hot, or the sun is basically hidden by clouds. And of course, you might say, well, why couldn't you just say that sometimes the sun is too hot? But keep in mind that Shakespeare has to keep to the meter, the iambic pentameter, the 10-syllable line. He's got to keep to the rhyme, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. He's got to keep to 14 lines, and he's got to keep to serious subject matter, lofty subject matter. And that's one of the greatest things about Shakespeare's sonnets is that he's able to keep to all of those parameters and follow all of those strict rules, and yet he is still able to show creativity and originality. And there's a long tradition, by the way, of linking the sun with the male. Notice how the sun is referred to as a his, and the moon is oftentimes, from a literary perspective, referred to as the female. And every fair from fair sometimes declines. And in this usage, fair is beauty. So if you've ever heard mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? In other words, who's the most beautiful? Fair isn't in reference to justice in this particular instance. Every fair from fair sometimes declines. In other words, all beauty experiences descent. By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. It either happens accidentally, that something or someone loses its beauty, or nature's changing course untrimmed is aging. That aging will ultimately take away beauty. But thy, or your, eternal summer shall not fade. That this person will have an eternal summer, even though we've already indicated that summer cannot be eternal. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. In other words, this person will always have beauty. Nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade. Notice death is capitalized, personifying death. And this idea of death being a male, there's a long literary tradition of that. Nor shall death brag, thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. In other words, this person will live eternally, that death will never take this person. So how is that possible? We need our last two lines, that final couplet, in order to be able to give us the ending, the punch, if you will, to the sonnet. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. In other words, as long as there are individuals who can breathe, in other words, they are alive, and can see, in other words, they can read, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Now, the problem with that line might be the pronoun this, because it's an unclear pronoun reference. We aren't told what the this is replacing which noun. But if I were to provide you with that noun, so long lives this sonnet, and this sonnet gives life to thee, then it becomes very clear that ultimately it's the poem itself that could grant this person's memory immortality. And it's very similar to what we saw in Sonnet 15, but in a much more direct way, stated that the power of the poet gives immortality. So Shakespeare is likening poetry, and specifically himself, to a god, because only God can give immortality, and Shakespeare. So you can see how subversive such a thing that would be when we think about Shakespeare likening himself to a god. But the reality is here we are in 2021 still talking about this person's memory. So arrogant or not, there was a certain level of truth to that, and the ability to immortalize through verse. The last sonnet that I wanted us to review in the early set of sonnets is very clearly written to a man, and that's why I selected it. And that's Sonnet 20, A Woman's Face with Nature's Own Hand Painted. A woman's face with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, the master mistress of my passion. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false women's fashion. An eye more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, gilding the object whereupon it gazeth. A man in hue all hues in his controlling, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth. And for a woman wert thou first created, till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting. And by addition me of thee defeated, by adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. But since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. So basically what we're being told here is that a woman's face with nature's own hand painted hast thou. So notice that the pause comes after the comma in the second line for thou. Even though the first line ends with the word painted, we still continue on without the pause. In other words, nature has painted this person into a beautiful individual. So much so that this individual has a woman's face, because women's faces are associated with beauty. And this idea of painting is in reference to cosmetics, because nature does this naturally, but humans can take this role as well and try to usurp nature and falsify nature, which Shakespeare is quite critical of in his sonnets as well as in his plays, as we will see. But basically, this person has the beauty of a woman's face, the master mistress of my passion. Now, this is a pun, and that this person has the beauty of a woman, but is a master, is a male. A woman's gentle heart, but not acquainted with shifting change, as is false women's fashion. So the stereotype of female is that a female has a gentle heart, which this person has, but this person does not have the fickleness that is associated with female. And when we talk about false women's fashion, reference to fashion would be very similar to reference to cosmetics, that this is a fake way of trying to portray beauty. So there's some punning here with the word fashion, that this is false women's fashion. This is the way that they tend to behave, but also fashion in terms of clothing. And eye more bright than theirs, less false and rolling, that a woman's eyes would roll in flirtatiousness. In other words, this would show her fickleness, but this person would not be fickle. And then, in fact, this person's eyes are so bright, it gildeth the object whereupon it gazeth. And basically, when you gild something, you cover it in gold. A man in hue all hues in his controlling. In other words, a man among all men, which steals men's eyes and women's souls amazeth, that both genders, male and female, are taken aback by this person's beauty. And for a woman wert thou first created. It's a very important line that basically makes it clear that this is a man, that this person was first created for a woman. Till nature, as she wrought thee, fell a doting. In other words, nature herself was so overcome by the beauty of this individual that nature herself dotes over or loves this person. And by addition, me of thee defeated. So nature added one thing that basically would not allow Shakespeare, the writer of this sonnet, in order to be able to pursue a relationship with this person. And what is the addition? By adding one thing to my purpose, nothing. The addition is adding the penis, and that is meant for women's pleasure. But since she pricked thee out, talking about nature, since she pricked thee out for women's pleasure, mine be thy love, and thy love's use, their treasure. I can love you, but the physical expression of love will be the treasure of females. Now, if you look at the word pricked in the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED, which is considered to be the dictionary of all dictionaries because it shows the history of word usage over time, with its first expression in literature going all the way to contemporary times. So when it used to be printed, it was a multi-volume work that looked much like an encyclopedia, just not cost-effective to print it anymore, so now you find it online. But the reason why it's so huge is, again, a word can have multiple pages devoted to a definition with illustrations of how it was used over time. And this is a particularly useful resource if you're looking up language from the past. As we've discussed previously, that words would have been used differently during Shakespeare's time and had different meanings than they do today. But if you look up the word pricked, it'll say that in 1592, there is a literary example of that word first being used as sexual slang for the male organ, and also as reference to stand erect. So there's some punning going on with the word pricked. And notice the P and the alliteration associated with this, in that proud and pricked and phallus and penis, which we will see more clearly in some of the later sonnets when we talk about the Dark Lady. But I wanted to begin with the Dark Lady. There's lots of speculation as to who she could be. Someone that at the very least Shakespeare admired and at the very most was having an active affair with. In Sonnet 127, the first sonnet I had assigned, it's very clear that this woman has dark features. And this is why I assigned this sonnet. In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now is black beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame. For since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress's eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem, at such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue says beauty should look so. So we're talking about how in the past, in the old age, black or dark features, dark hair and dark eyes, not necessarily dark complexion, were not counted fair or beautiful. Dark features were not considered to be beautiful. Or if it were, it didn't bear beauty's name. Or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. There's lots of references here to family and lineage. Names, heir, bastard. And it's something that we will see as well in Shakespeare's plays, and the idea of what is legitimate and illegitimate. But now is black beauty's successive heir. Notice the pun of the word heir there, and that an heir, again, could be a legitimate succession in a family, but an heir, particularly with original pronunciation, which by far seemed to be what most people preferred, at least according to the attendance question. I suspect heir and heir would have been pronounced similarly, if not exactly. And this is in reference to the woman's dark hair, as well as the fact that she is beauty's heir. For such each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face. Again, a reference to cosmetics and individuals usurping nature and God by trying to mimic beauty and to portray beauty, but it's merely a falsehood. Sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower, but is profaned, if not lives in disgrace. In other words, it's disgraceful to try to mimic beauty, and in fact, it's it's profane to do such a thing because it's unnatural. Therefore, my mistress's eyes are raven black. And mistress at the time would have meant female. It didn't necessarily mean a female that one was having an illicit affair with, but it did mean a young female. Therefore, my mistress's eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited. And if you think about eyes, then ultimately the reference before eyes is her. So we get a pronoun that directly is in reference to gender. And they mourners seem, at such who not born fair no beauty lack. And basically, this sonnet is talking about that darkness and sadness has a certain level of beauty to it. And I can't help but think of Shakespeare's tragedies, which are usually the plays that most readers gravitate towards. And they too have a darkness and a sadness, but a beauty associated with them. So I think that we can relate this to Shakespeare's tragedies just as easily as we can relate this to the Dark Lady. If we move on to Sonnet 130, which happens to be one of my favorite sonnets. This sonnet is in direct contrast to Sonnet 18, the Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day. And here, rather than a sonnet of hyperbole and exaggeration, which is what many of the love sonnets are, we have a sonnet of reality. And this sonnet reads, "My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I've seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet by heaven I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare." So the sonnet of realism talks about that this woman, my mistress's eyes, don't look anything like the sun, because no one's eyes can be as bright as the sun. And coral is much more red than her lips, because lips really aren't red. And if snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. In other words, no one's skin is truly white. They are dun or dark or swarthy. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. In other words, that her hair isn't soft and silky, because no one's hair truly is soft and silky. I've seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. In other words, the blush is not natural. It's put on with cosmetics. Then in the breath that from my mistress reeks, at the time reeks would have meant exhaled. It didn't necessarily have a negative connotation the way it does today. But we do know that they weren't very well known in the time of the Renaissance for their for their upkeeping of their bodies, so and their sanitation methods. So it could indeed be that her breath reeked. I think about the stinkers, for instance, but at any rate, reeks would not necessarily be negative, but that in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. No one's voice is like music. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. In other words, no one walks like a goddess. They don't float on air, because we all walk on the ground. And then we get those last two lines, which of course completely changes the tone of the sonnet. And yet by heaven I think my love is rare. My love is as extraordinary as any she belied. Notice the reference to the female pronoun. With false compare. His love is more real, more strong, and more deep than any love that would be for a woman who has this false comparison of being compared to, well, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Though that wasn't necessarily written to a woman. That no one can live up to that particular standard. And this is a way also for Shakespeare to comment on the hyperbole and exaggeration of sonnet writing in general, and to critique that, as well as to illustrate the reality of the deep love that he has for someone who has imperfection. The last sonnet that I had assigned, and notice how many of these sonnets have comparisons, black and white, good and bad, and that's something that we'll see in the plays as well. The last sonnet was Sonnet 151, and this sonnet I deliberately assigned because, again, it's one of Shakespeare's more bawdy sonnets, again, to illustrate that Shakespeare did not shy away from sexuality in his writing. And he says in Sonnet 151, "Love is too young to know what conscience is. Yet who knows not conscience is born of love? Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss, lest guilty of my faults thy sweet self prove. For thou betraying me, I do betray my nobler part to my gross body's treason. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. Flesh stays, no farther reason. But rising at thy name doth point out thee as his triumphant prize. Proud of this pride, he is contented thy poor drudge to be, to stand in thy affairs, fall by thy side. No want of conscience hold it that I call her love, for whose dear love I rise and fall. And this is a sonnet that's trying to talk about morality and conscience, the moral sense of something, and then the spiritual sense of something as compared to the physical sense of something, or the spirit versus the flesh. And we see the battle between the two as Shakespeare is talking about, that he wants to have a pure spiritual love for this person, but he can't help but have a fleshy and an erotic attraction to this person. And that love is too young to know what conscience is that young doesn't know what conscience is. Yet who knows not conscience is born of love. After love, that's when we begin to think about questions of morality. Before love, we don't need to do that. Then, gentle cheater, urge not my amiss. In other words, don't tempt me, please. And then by doing so, you basically are betraying me and betraying morality. For thou betraying me, I do betray my nobler part. In other words, he is betraying his soul, his spiritual love, to his gross body's treason. His body is treasonous because it's doing that which is the exact opposite of what he wants it to do. It's showing sexual attraction. My soul doth tell my body that he may triumph in love. In other words, I'm telling myself that I can overcome these erotic desires. Flesh stays no farther reason, but the flesh won't listen. But rising at thy name, the flesh rises at thy name and points out thee, you, as his triumphant prize. So what flesh is it that's rising at her name? Well, his phallus, his penis. This is a discussion of erection. Proud of this pride, he is contented thy poor drudge to be. Notice the P sounds here: proud, pride, phallus, penis. He is contented thy poor drudge or slave to be. In other words, his body is a slave to his passion and a slave to her because she can control his passion. To stand in thy affairs and fall by thy side. In other words, the erection is controlled by her. And when we talk about affairs, we can also talk about matters, but we can also talk about sexual affairs as well. So there's some punning here. No want of conscience hold it that I call her love, for whose dear love I rise and fall. Again, the idea that this is a very bawdy sonnet, that ultimately he is a slave to his sexual desire for her. So there are lots of other sonnets that we could read, but I thought these 6 might give us a little bit of a sense of some of Shakespeare's language. As I had indicated, try not to read necessarily Shakespeare's language verbatim, word for word. Try to get just a general understanding of it. Think of it as a foreign language that you know perhaps 95% of. Understand that even if you could understand all of the words, the scholars themselves acknowledge that they are not certain of all of the meanings of the words. And there weren't standardized meanings in the way that we have today. There certainly weren't standardized dictionaries at the time. And oftentimes language was created by Shakespeare himself, and some of it has been incorporated into our contemporary language, and some of it has never been used again. Plus, we also know that there are also textual issues, that this is, to the best of our understanding and our best of our knowledge, what Shakespeare wrote 7 years after his death, where his contemporaries got together and tried to preserve his works. But we know that there's some controversy associated with that. However, what I think you can see in these sonnets are some of the themes and issues that we are going to be seeing with the plays themselves. And we're going to begin next class by talking about what scholars believe are Shakespeare's earlier set of plays, his comedies. So we'll talk about what makes a comedy and why we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Ideally, it would be nice if you had read the play in its entirety by Wednesday, but I am also a realist, so that might not necessarily be possible. Read as much as you can. We will be watching a performance of the play, which is in no way a substitute for the play. That's merely a supplement, but that should help you understand the play. As you will soon see, Shakespeare's plays were meant to be performed. So not only listen to, because based on the way audience seats were, it's very possible that you weren't able to see much of the action, but you can certainly hear the vocal inflections, much like you can hear a sonnet. And once you see a performance, you'll see how the play can really come alive. Any actor will tell you that a script is pretty flat until the actor brings their magic to it. And at the time, there would have been some pretty well-known actors. Richard Burbage, for instance. They would have been given prime roles, so it would be comparable to, oh, I don't know, the Brad Pitts of today, I suppose, or the Tom Cruises, if you wanted to think of something like that. So we'll talk a little bit more about Midsummer next class and spend several classes watching a performance and ultimately discussing the play. And then eventually you would be writing a journal about that play. And that hopefully will be something that you can complete before we move on to our next play, which happens to be Much Ado About Nothing. So ideally, while we're talking about Midsummer Night's Dream, you've read it and you're reading the next play coming up. And we'll also talk a little bit more about papers as well as the semester progresses. For today's attendance question, I thought it might be interesting to hear that out of the sonnets that we've read in class, which one is your favorite and why? So which one of the 6 sonnets that we studied is your favorite and why? Again, a question that has no right or wrong answer. Just curious to hear what your thinking is. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with A Midsummer Night's Dream. Take care. Bye-bye.